I think most of us, you listening and I, live in the backend. We build the systems that make everything work, and we spend most of our day thinking about data models, creating pipelines, query understanding, re-ranking, search, but we are often far away from the users. And this is the gap we rarely notice, that users bring their own mental models to our creations, and these often clash with our pipelines, with our logic, with our data structure, and then we deliver bad results. And today we are talking to Jorge Arango, who is an expert in information architecture. And we are talking about how we can let information do its job, which is helping people make better choices. And we explore how to build systems that match how your users think, not just how our systems in the backend, how computers process the data. Let's do it. Your podcast, it's like such a refreshing difference, because like most of my podcasts are AI centered as well, and it's so refreshing to get a very different perspective on like the whole field.
Yeah, it's a little bit all over the place just because the subject is a bit broad, how people manage information. So
Yeah,
that gives a lot of latitude.
yeah, and also lots of different people. I think I listened to at least 50,
Wow.
um and it's really interesting, like who you got on, like from what fields, like some really old school, some really new. That's really cool in my opinion.
Yeah, one of the underlying principles, one of the things that I hope comes across is that a lot of the things that we talk about are actually timeless. The technology might be new, but the ideas are not
Yeah.
new.
What were the 2 to 3 most interesting things you've learned in the podcast?
Oh, wow. It's really hard for me to mention any three right off the top of my head. I had a conversation early on in the show's history with somebody who managed the record collection for the Danish broadcasting company. And this was a physical record collection, like music collection, but it was like physical records. And I remember that being a really interesting conversation that entailed making decisions about how to organize music when it could only be organized on one dimension because
Yeah,
physical space, right? Like when you're dealing with software, you can organize things based on lots of different dimensions, but when you're organizing things in physical space, you have to make choices. So I remember that one being really interesting. It's I've always gotten something out of every episode. Some of the subjects I knew more about than others going into it, but the the main thing about it for me is not so much the ideas as it is the connection with the people. And a big part of that podcast was recorded during the pandemic, and for me it was a, just a lifesaver because I'm someone who likes to meet people. I like to go to conferences, and I like to talk with people and see what they're up to. And the podcast gave me a really good excuse to reach out to folks during the pandemic when we couldn't do that and say, "Hey, can I talk with you for an hour and share
yeah,
our conversation?" And that was great.
yeah, for sure. And do you think that, it makes me really curious, do you think the constraints we have in a physical world is makes it a little bit easier to organize stuff because you don't have so many choices?
Yeah, there's something to that, right? The whole paradox of choice thing. That's where smart defaults come in. For a lot of things, you can get by with a few smart defaults, and you don't need to. That's something that it's taken me a while to learn that, but eventually I did learn it that even if a system offers you all sorts of capabilities, doesn't mean that you have to take advantage of all of them, right? Like you can focus on a few basic things and get many of the benefits that you're going to get from the thing with a relatively small amount of effort.
What are some of the most interesting defaults you have seen, or also the weirdest ones?
One that immediately comes to mind is whenever I buy a new laptop, I upgrade my Mac. I've been using Apple laptops for a long time, and whenever I get a new one, I oftentimes start from scratch. So you know how there are people who like will migrate their old configuration to the new one. You're shaking your head as no.
I don't do that either. Finally, the
Yeah.
time to get rid of stuff.
That's exactly right. It's an opportunity to get rid of some things that might not be working for you. So I like to take that opportunity to do a little bit of house cleaning. And with so much stuff being on the cloud these days, it's relatively easy to get back up and running, right? It's feasible to do that. And it used to be that I would spend a lot of time, whenever I did that, I would spend a lot of time tailoring everything so that it functioned exactly the way I wanted it to, and tweaking things. And there eventually came a time where I realized that doing that entails a lot of maintenance. You have if you install a lot of software, the more software you install, the more software you have to maintain, you have to upgrade. And I've slowly learned to live more and more with just kind of default stuff, using Apple Mail instead of playing around with different specialized mail clients. That would be an example of that, right? I'm sure if you saw my computer, you would go, "Oh my gosh, he's got all this custom stuff." But I
Yeah,
aspire to anyway.
I think that's really interesting. I think I'm the going to the opposite. I have 4 different code editors which I'm using most of the time. I'm switching around it.
Yeah, I say that, and I'm taking notes here using Emacs, which is talk about something that requires a lot of customization, right? And I've been using Emacs for, we're coming on 25 years now, and over that time, you pick up a lot of little tweaks.
Yeah. Nice. What do you think about, like, when you hear the data model defines the application, what comes to your head?
The first thing I have to say is that I am not a developer, all right? And I have to say that up front because I suspect that for this podcast, I would imagine that a high percentage of the audience are folks who know a lot more about development than I do. I'm primarily a designer of information systems. And when I hear the phrase you used was data model, but what comes to my mind is all systems have an underlying conceptual structure that either adequately reflects the mental models that its users bring to the interaction or they don't. And the data model is where that conceptual model often gets made normative. It becomes baked into the infrastructure of the application, right? And I mentioned working with Emacs, which is it's a very old software application, right? And when you work with a system that old, its idiosyncrasies and anachronisms come through, right? And in some ways, that is its underlying model shining through to the user interface. And the I see the data model as a place where these conceptual models get reified and become part of the infrastructure of the application, and often end up manifesting in the user interface, which is one of the things that people like me try to help with. So that my ideal, the thing that I aspire to, is to design systems where somebody can sit in front of them and think, oh, the person who designed this really gets me. They really get how I think. That requires understanding the mental models of the people who use the system and what their expectations are. And I realize that the data model plays a different role. And for people like myself, oftentimes what we need to do, I said that I function sometimes as a translator that aims to make a system that is understandable and usable to end users but also is possible to implement by developers. So it's almost like a translation role.
Yeah, I think that's something designers like to forget. They sometimes get caught up in like the really nitty gritty details, which are often a real pain to implement in the end. If you would flip it around, if you would have to build like the worst information system, how would you start it and what would you do?
The worst information system.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So it might be worthwhile to take a step back and think about what information is. It's one of those, information is one of those terms that we use quite casually without really pausing to think about what it is that we mean by it. And whenever I ask students, for example, to say, it's like, what do you understand by information? I think that when you try to articulate it, you find that it's challenging. The way that I like to think about information is that information is anything that helps you make better choices so that you can act more skillfully, right? So the example that I use, for me, it's like the canonical example. I used to live in a place in a kind of typical American suburb that had houses with front lawns. And I would walk my dog through the neighborhood. And some houses would have these little signs out in the front lawn with, you may have seen these, with a dog pooping and a don't poop here sign. It's like with a little circle with a line through it, right? Meaning, some of these houses had made an explicit choice to say to the other people in the neighborhood, you should not allow your dog to go here, right? Those little signs are information. They're helping me make a decision when I'm walking my dog about whether I let the dog go there or not. And in so doing, they help me possibly predict what might happen. If I let the dog go in a yard that has one of those signs and the owner comes out, I may get punched in the nose or screamed at or something. So information is about helping us make better choices. And I would think that a system that is designed to do the opposite of inform you would be a system that you find completely irrelevant to you, a system that doesn't offer you any useful guidance to things that you care about, things that you want to get done. And it might be that it's a system that is perfectly usable and interesting and useful to somebody else. It's just not for you, right? Maybe that's something that we could design an AI system that detects what you're interested in and what you want to do, and then it does completely the opposite, right? Or it builds an interface that is so obfuscated that it actually makes it difficult for you to glean the things you need to glean to do the things you need to do. That would be the opposite of an information system that is designed to help people, I would think.
Do you think the design should also clearly communicate who it is not for?
I don't know that it should be explicit about it. I think that well-designed systems, it's really hard to categorize it like that, but there are systems that you interact with that you can see them. When you see them, you immediately know, oh, this is designed for somebody. This is well designed, but it's not for me, right? And that tells you subtly that it has been thought through. It just has been thought through for a different audience. I'm sure that you've interacted with systems where you're asked to self-select into an audience. I think that's one way to do it. It's just a bit of a blunt instrument. One that immediately comes to mind is Leica, the camera company, right? Let me open the website to make sure that this is still true so that I don't sound like I'm disparaging them, right? But when I remember visiting that website, Leica.com, and yeah, it's still like that. And when you first open Leica.com, you'll be greeted with a homepage that tells you up front that Leica, the brand Leica, actually refers to four different companies that share the same name. And there's very little indication as to what these companies are. there are photographs of different products, right? And then there are slide over. So when you slide over the product, you get a little slide over with a sentence that describes what these things are, right? So this would be an example of a website that is asking the user to self-select into a particular audience. And I would imagine that they have good reasons to do this. If you are sharing your brand with three other companies that do very different things, you're going to get a lot of emails from people going, "Where are the microscopes?" or whatever, if you're the camera company, right? So they have to do this. But this would be like one end of the spectrum. I would imagine that there are ways to do this more subtly in less extreme circumstances.
So, do you think like specificity of a website, like what are you selling and why is the user actually here, is the most important thing?
I think clarity is the most important thing. And what you're describing is a manifestation of clarity. Some information domains require more explanation than others. For example, if you visit a website that you've never seen before, and it belongs to a brand that you've never seen before, so you have very little in the way of a mental model, but you start reading a navigation structure that uses terms like savings, checking, credit cards, loans, right? You don't have to know a lot more than that navigation menu to get a mental picture that you are operating within the context of some kind of financial services organization, probably a bank, right? And because you've interacted with those types of organizations in the past, you have expectations that you bring to that interaction about what you might likely encounter there, what kinds of things you might or might not be able to do there, what kind of structure that experience will have. For example, bank websites usually have some kind of login box where you can enter your username and password and pass from the marketing side of the house to the more private your account side of the house. So all those things are things that you bring to that interaction implicitly. The bank doesn't have to tell you those things because banking is a known activity, and we've been doing banking online for long enough where you know what to expect. If it's a different kind of business or a different kind of organization, one that offers a novel service, for example, you have a bit more explaining to do and you have to do a lot more context setting. And we see that a lot with new technologies, particularly now where there's a lot of stuff happening around AI. People are coming to these experiences without having very solid mental models about what the thing is and how they can use it, how they can interact with it. And you have some more explaining to do. The degree to which you have to fill in those gaps depends a lot on the particular use case, the particular scenario. Clarity is what you're aiming for, and that requires that you understand who you're talking with, who your audience is, and what the subject domain is that they need to interact with.
Do you think this is one of the biggest issues with search boxes and chatbots, that many companies just throw it on there without thinking about like how to tell the user how to use it correctly, and also to try to understand how the user will and could use it?
Yeah, search boxes and prompts, right? Like the chat boxes for chatbots and stuff like that. It's very interesting because they're so useful, right? There's no denying that search boxes and chatbots are incredibly useful, but they're useful in a particular range of scenarios, particularly the ones where the user comes to the interaction with some kind of mental model about what they can expect to find there, right? That is actually more true of search boxes than it is of chatbots. I think that with Gen AI, we do have the opportunity to have these things be more conversational and try to help the user find their way to what they're looking for. But the interface doesn't give you a lot of clues as to what you might expect there. I have this thing that I like to say that English, and I'm just calling out English because it's what we're speaking now, but English is a human API, right? It allows us to interact, but it's super powerful, but it's also very open-ended. And if you come to an interaction and all is a blinking cursor, it's almost like you have to take the first step, and you have to know what you expect to find there in order to interact skillfully with the system. It's actually a throwback to the way that computers used to work 40, 50 years ago, when before the GUI era, you interacted using a command line prompt. And that required that you know the magic incantations that allowed the computer to list your files and change to a different directory or copy a file from one directory to another, right? The interface itself didn't give you clues as to what you could do there. One of the great innovations, one of the reasons why GUIs took over the world, is that when you expose the options in an interface where people can see what they can do there, you are making the possibility space visible in some ways, right? Like, you're not requiring that the user take this first step of exploring the subject domain. So I do think that search boxes are very powerful. They're obviously an important component of many systems, particularly the ones with a lot of content in them. But I don't think they're going to replace interfaces that allow people to browse through the options in a system, for that reason primarily.
When we chatted the first time, you mentioned something very interesting, which is that information architecture is more like an education, and that through the choices you make in designing it, you try to educate the user about the field and direct him where he can go and also how he could search. Can you maybe go into what a great information architecture in the terms of education looks like, and what tools you can use to actually construct it?
Yeah, let me tackle the first part of that first to expand a little bit on that. There is a misunderstanding about user interface design. I'll talk specifically about UI design. There is a misunderstanding as to what the goal of user interface design is. I think a lot of people think that the goal is to make interfaces intuitive. And you will often hear that word use. It's like it needs to be intuitive. Very few things are intuitive. There's a long-running joke in the industry that, and I don't know if this is considered inappropriate, but the joke is that the only intuitive interface for humans is the nipple. Everything else is learned. And there is a saying from Richard Saul Wurman, who is a person who popularized information architecture, and he says that people only understand things relative to things they already understand. And I think that's a very powerful idea. If you think back to how you learned something like a new concept, something that was new to you, the way that you likely learned it is by relating that concept to ideas that you already knew. So there are very few things that we encounter that are impossible to relate to other ideas. Whenever we learn something new, we usually do it by scaffolding our understanding of that new idea on things that we already know. How that would play out in something like an information architecture is, imagine that you're designing a system that is for a novel financial services application, some kind of newfangled financial services product, something that when users encounter it, they're going to need to have someone explain it to them, because it's just the mental model is so different that they're not going to know how to operate it. it's likely that there is at least some language that you have to use that is going to be novel to those users. And if you expose that language right off the bat in things like your navigation structures, people who get to that place are likely not going to know how to make choices about what they need to do. They need to be inducted into the language to make skillful decisions. So, one way to do that is by using language that is familiar to them, and then through that language, expose them to the new ideas. For example, it might be that your navigation structures in the system use terms that they are familiar with from financial services. And then when they read the content of those pages, then you explain the new concept in the context of this thing that they already understand, right? So that would be an example of trying to make a learnable interface. I like to say that is what we aspire to, especially with complex systems that are presenting a lot of novel ideas. You should not try to make those intuitive. You should try to make them learnable. And that entails understanding what your users are likely to know and then structuring interfaces that give them enough clues so that they can find their way to getting things done, even though they might not be familiar with the concepts that they need to do in order to get them done.
So you basically see it as a journey. You have a lot of different users, so you have a lot of different starting points, but you have to design a system that actually takes them to a joint destination. How do you actually account for like the different background skill levels that you can have in the users?
You have to do research. First of all, you have to understand who the users are. And different systems are going to have different kinds of users. In some ways, the hardest systems to design are the ones that have to appeal to a lot of different audiences with very different skill levels. I'll give you an example of systems in both ends of the spectrum. I once helped with the design of an energy futures trading marketplace. So this was a place where energy traders, note that it's a very specialized audience, right? Energy traders they would use this tool to buy and sell energy futures for different regions. That is a very specialized type of user. And they, in understanding how these people do their work, when you sit down with them, you quickly come to the realization that they have to move to make decisions quickly. They have to see a lot of information. The interfaces have to be very dense. And that entails, they use a lot of very kind of jargony terminology, a lot of acronyms that to me, even as a designer, they don't mean anything. But to these people, it's like these are the terms that they use when they're doing their work. And if you know that going into it, you can design a system that is going to help them get their work done, right? On the opposite end of the spectrum, I once helped with a project for a website whose target was anybody residing in the state of California. That is a much broader audience, right? Like that audience needs to be, you have to assume at that point that you are dealing with people for whom English might be a second language, who might be at different levels of education, of comprehension. You cannot use jargon. You cannot use a lot of obscure terminology. So you have to really, you have to really pare things down. And you have to do it with the knowledge that might be frustrating for some users. So like the more specialized users might find the kind of overly simple interface to be talking down to them or maybe on making things unnecessarily complicated. So there are techniques to overcome that. One of them is called progressive disclosure. The idea that by default, the system is structured in such a way that it speaks universally to everybody. But then you give the people who are more knowledgeable or who have more expertise, you give them clear signals as to what part of the system they can go to find all the shortcuts, right? I think of the prototypical example in that space. There was a tool in the 1980s that Apple put out called HyperCard, which was the first hypermedia editor that I ever saw. And this thing by default looked like a drawing program where you would move around buttons. It was Visual Studio before Visual Studio existed, right? You would drop buttons and you would manipulate these user interfaces visually to create a hypertext. And if that's all you wanted to do, you could do a lot of stuff just at that level. But behind the scenes, there was a programming language. And once you became a proficient enough user, the people who designed that application had made it possible for you to discover the fact that there was this other layer behind it. And once you understood that there was a programming language behind the scenes, all of a sudden, all sorts of power it's like you unlocked a new level in the application. So the application could be used by both types of users successfully. And of course, there were people who never crafted their own interfaces or did any programming. They were just end users of work that other people had done. So this thing was usable by people of different levels of proficiency by design. And that's that's a strategy that we can use in products to address that issue.
Yeah. What do you actually think is the importance of setting a boundary around the domain you're working in?
There are many benefits to setting a boundary around the domain. I think that the most important one, for me at least, is that we're always functioning in some context. This conversation that you and I are having, we're having it within a particular context, right? Your podcast, the topic of your podcast sets a context. The fact that we're talking about technology, like I feel like I can trot out these old examples of things like HyperCard and it will be understood by the audience because we share some kind of common ground here that we're talking about technology. All interactions happen within a context. The context influences how we understand what we're doing, how we understand each other. Language is often meaningful in context. Terms acquire different meanings depending on where you experience them. An example of that is the verb save. So save is a common everyday word, but save means different things if you use it in the context of computing, like we're talking about now. If you use it in the context of a bank, that it means a different thing. If you use it in the context of a church, it means a different thing, right? So it's the same word, but it means different things. And it's very important when designing a system where people are meant to carry out certain tasks. It's very important that they understand where they are so that they know what is expected of them and what they can expect to do there. We talked earlier about the bank, right? If you are visiting an online bank, if you're using an online bank, you're going to have expectations about what you can and cannot do there. And you're going to have expectations about what certain words mean in that context. A bank that used very different language or that created a very different context would make it challenging for people to get things done, right? Because you would lose all the benefits that we have from experiences in interacting with these services in other scenarios in the real world. So yeah, setting the boundaries of a domain helps us create contexts, and contexts have a huge influence in how skillful we can be when carrying out certain tasks. So I would say that's one of the most important reasons why you would want to be clear about the domain.
Would this mean that the clearer or the narrower the boundaries, the clearer the context, the easier it is to design an information architecture?
I think that the clearer you are on what it is that the system is supposed to do and who it's supposed to do it for, the easier it is to design an information architecture. The hardest systems to design are the ones that are meant to do a lot of things for a lot of different people. Just because it's the very nature of the exercise makes it so that you have to do all these layering things that we were talking about earlier. You have to give ways for people with different skill levels and different abilities to find their way to what they need to do. Whereas a system that is more narrowly focused, it's easier for you to understand the people who are going to be using it, what they expect to do there, what they need to do there, what the company, if it's a commercial thing, what does the company need to get out of it? The company also has certain objectives that it expects the system to do. Maybe you want the system to allow people to buy more stuff if it's a store, right? Or maybe you want the system to encourage conversions. So when the narrower the domain, the easier it is for you to answer questions around who is using the thing, what do they need to see when they get there to get their stuff done, and what is the business context which has brought this thing forth into being, like the company, the organization, like what do they want out of it? Those questions, the narrower the domain, usually the easier it is to define those, and then you're off and running.
Yeah, and same goes like from a search perspective, especially. I talked to an engineer from Reddit who is doing their search relevance work, and they have a lot of things they have to work through because the search on Reddit is so broad. They have like hundreds of different topics or like things that could happen, and depending on the user, which like community they're in, it's always something different, and this makes it like really challenging but also really interesting in the end.
Yeah, I would imagine that Reddit is that's an example of a system that must satisfy a lot of different use cases. Something like Google is another one, right? It's like an open-ended search engine, which has a lot of other services baked into it. These are examples of systems that must be universally usable and must be usable for lots of different use cases. Those are much harder to deal with.
Yeah. And I'm not sure whether you know RAG, of course. He's starting a counter movement he's calling GAR, so Generative AI Augmented Retrieval. How do you think LLMs can help people navigate websites, but also in search in general?
It's very clear that LLMs are a major innovation and one that is going to transform things significantly. I don't know that we are sure yet about how it's going to play out. Um, I do think that it's going to change things like the search experience, where we already see it, right, with systems like Perplexity, where rather than you entering a phrase or a set of keywords and getting back a list of pointers to web pages, you're getting back answers with references to where you can follow up, right? So there's this notion of parsing the request more conversationally and then providing you an answer that is looking to be more of an answer and less of a kind of list of references. I think that's like the most obvious near-term change. But I think that there's also clearly lots of opportunities to use these tools to improve the way that regular old-fashioned search works. One way could be by helping parse out the intent behind what you're searching for, so that you take the phrase that you've entered or the keywords that you've entered and maybe try to add a little bit more context, perhaps based on previous interactions, right? And issue a search based on that. You've mentioned RAG. RAG is an attempt. I think of it as a way to improve the quality of the results that you get from interacting with an LLM by fusing it with techniques that come from the search world, right? Like you're basically injecting search results into the context window that gets for the prompt that gets sent to the LLM. So I think that there's opportunities both to explore novel interfaces, but there's opportunities to also improve the things that we're already doing, like search. Or in my case, I've been using LLMs both straight up and also using RAG to do my work as an information architect. And this is just for structuring, like old-fashioned structuring web content, right? I've used LLMs to help me retag large content repositories, I'm using it to help design new navigation structures for websites. Because if nothing else, these are incredibly powerful text processing tools that let you analyze a lot more information a lot faster than we were able to before these things existed. So I see them improving the work that we do both through novel experiences that we are able to generate and also because they empower us in designing the sort of systems we were designing before, only faster, better, and cheaper, basically.
Yeah. What I always like to ask is, especially with LLMs, is overrated versus underrated. What's an overrated technology and what's an underappreciated technology or technique that you see at the moment?
Or just in general?
No, very general.
In general, overrated and underrated. So I think that for the underrated one, I would say, yeah, I would harken back to where we started in today's conversation talking about models. You asked about the data model, right? So there is an equivalent in the design space, which are conceptual models, and I think a lot of designers. I'm going to generalize, but I think this is true. I think a lot of designers, when they start the design work, they do research. Fortunately, that's already become ingrained. The fact that you do have to do research, you have to understand the problem domain, and then there's this idea that once you have a grip on the problem domain, then you start designing. And what that means for a lot of designers is they start sketching screens. They start drawing, like they start doing these little sketches to think through what the interface is going to look like. And not just me, but a lot of people argue that there's a step that comes before that where rather than sketching the implications at the UI level, you start thinking through the conceptual model that is going to inform the UI. This is the equivalent of the data model in development, in that you're thinking about the concepts that need to be present in the system for people to get stuff done and how those concepts relate to each other. I think it's underrated because, frankly, a lot of people don't know about this. They don't do it when they're doing design work. And it's very important because it leads to systems that are more cohesive and coherent, particularly when dealing with large systems, because they allow you to see the big picture. When it comes to overrated, I have to say, I'm going to say one that is specifically in the realm of information architecture, which is my area of focus, and it's sitemaps. I think that a lot of people associate information architecture with sitemaps. I've seen a lot of portfolios, particularly for student portfolios, they usually have for a project they'll have a little part that says here's the information architecture, and it's always a sitemap, right? And sitemaps are a useful design artifact that you can use to communicate intent, but they are not the end all be all. And the issue that I have with them is that they imply a kind of hierarchical rigidity that isn't actually true of most interactive systems. Most interactive systems are not laid out in this inverted tree, right? Like there's more than one way to get to a particular part of the system. And the sitemaps do away with a lot of the nuance and complexity that make interactive systems so rich. So I would say that is a tool that is greatly overrated. I would do a lot more conceptual modeling than site mapping if I was a designer, if I didn't know what I know.
Yeah. I love them, but just for an entire different reason, that it's very great for scraping websites when you have a good sitemap.
They're very useful. They're very useful for a variety of things. For example, they're very useful for conveying intent around the overall structure of a website, right? But you have to go into it understanding that most interactive systems are not rigidly hierarchical. And I think that's a very important thing for people to remember, because you don't want, particularly for complex systems, you don't want this rigid top-down thing. You lose a lot of opportunities to add nuance and to and to make a system that is really responsive to user needs and user interactions by if you start dictating structure from the top down. And I don't think that sitemaps force you into that direction, but certainly the form of the diagram strongly suggests that you do that, right? So you have to be careful with the tools you use.
If you could enforce one practice in engineers, what would it be? Like, especially from the designer's perspective.
I'm sorry, you cut up a little bit. Can you ask the question again?
If you could enforce one practice in engineers, what would it be? Especially from the designer's perspective. So you have the chance to fix one of your annoyances.
I think it would be presumptuous of me to try to enforce anything on engineers. If anything, I would love to learn from engineers rather than enforce anything on them. I would say though that one thing that let's use different terminology. What would be good for engineers and designers to talk about when they go out to lunch or something like that? I think that one of the things where designers can contribute to the conversation is in bringing the user's perspective into the equation, right? So, what I was talking about earlier, understanding that different people have different levels of competency, different levels of familiarity with the subject domain. All of that stuff, designers can contribute to the conversation through research, through modeling, through things like what I talked about earlier, progressive disclosure, like this notion that you build layers in that accommodate different levels of competency. Those are all things where I think designers can contribute. I would also love to say to flip the conversation around and say, I think that designers could benefit from a lot more designers could benefit from understanding how things are built, how the systems that they are designing are built. There's this long running argument in the design space about whether designers should know how to code. And there are some people who vehemently feel like that's asking too much of designers. I feel differently about that. I think that it's very important for designers to understand the materials that they're working with. When I was an architecture student, we had a class called Materials of Construction where we had to learn the math behind materials, so like how do you calculate the tensile strength of steel. But we also had a studio, like a lab course, where we would learn how to do arc welding. And when you understand the capabilities and constraints of a material firsthand, you become a much more skillful designer, is how I feel. So I don't expect that. I wasn't, when I was in architecture school, I don't think anyone intended for us to become contractors. And I don't expect that any designers are going to become engineers or developers. But it would be good to understand what the software can and cannot do, right? You asked about the data model. You need to understand how data is structured if you're going to be creating information systems. So I do feel that both engineers and designers have a lot to teach each other.
Yeah. What's next for you? What are you excited about?
I'm excited about everything. Being involved in technology is a just an endless gift because this is a field that keeps evolving. And there's this saying, I don't know if you've heard this, it's from Bill Gates. He said something like, we always overestimate the change that will happen in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will happen in the next 10 years, right? And if you think back, and I think that's true, right? I've felt it myself. But if you think back just over the last 2 years, there's no way that we could have underestimated the change that we've seen since ChatGPT released in the fall of 2022, right? And the language, LLMs and machine learning have been around for a lot longer than that. But grafting this chat user interface on top of it really blew it up, right? Like it made it clear to a lot of people just how powerful these systems are. And it's just very clear to me that we are going through yet another one of these major technological shifts that keep this work so fresh and so interesting, and frankly is bringing a lot of benefit to a lot of people in the world. So I'm super gung ho for that. I'll also say something else that I'm excited about, although it's I think less tangible and less ironically less tangible and less popular right now, which is spatial computing. And I don't mean spatial computing in the sense of extended reality or virtual reality, like with Vision Pro and these things. Just pervasive computing in physical environments. There's this project called Dynamic Land that Brett Victor and a bunch of other folks have been doing for several years. About they're basically building a computer that is a physical space, a collaborative physical space where you can interact with information using things that you're familiar with: paper, pen, marbles, little things that you move around. That kind of thing is hugely exciting to me. I guess it's on my mind because I just released a new website for Dynamic Land just yesterday. And that stuff has so much potential. We've been interacting with computers through these small glass rectangles that we carry around in our pockets and in our backpacks. But computers can be so much more than that, right? And we can bring our whole bodies to these interactions. And there's just so much potential when you think about that, right? So I see nothing but possibilities on the road ahead, and I'm very excited about it all.
Yeah. And if people want to get in touch with you, where can they do that?
The best place is my website, jarango.com. So that's jarango.com. And you can follow me there. There's pointers to my social media. I have a newsletter, and I write a lot about information architecture, how to leverage artificial intelligence for doing this kind of work. And I'm very active both there and on social channels, particularly LinkedIn these days.
And also a great podcast. I think if you're listening to this, you might like it as well. And we will link to all of that in the show notes.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you, Nicolay.
So what can we take away when we are building our applications? So first of all, before you write any code, you want to really map the conceptual model or the understanding you have and your users have of the problem you're solving or the solution you're building. And it's often really interesting to listen to how users talk about the problem space and just to put yourself in the frame of reference they have of how a problem has to be solved. And the same goes into testing. Like when you build your system, like testing, naming and your application with real users really pays off in the long term. And for more complex applications, something like progressive disclosure, where you have a simple entry point and really good defaults, which allow the user to get started quickly, but in depth, like for example, keyboard shortcuts for power users, is something I think most applications are missing. Something that we as developers are used to, because most of us start with a really easy code editor to use like VS Code, and over time configure it more and more, or switch to other code editors like NeoVim, which is completely tailored and customized to how we work. And so many applications are missing stuff like that. Like the people who spend time thinking about the defaults that are being set and also what configurations I want to expose to the user. And I think like the last reminder, if the user can find it, it doesn't exist. So, and this holds for like search results, but also for settings, configurations, features. And this is a general practice I think we should pick up more and more. If something isn't used, just delete it. And this goes for like repos, features, codes, uncommon or like comments, especially stuff that is commented out and just left in there. Just delete it. Most of the time you're better off not having it, and at some point you still can restore it if you have version control set up, but you rather want to remove it and release the cognitive burden for future engineers which might stumble over the code. And yeah, that's it for the episode. This is actually our last episode in search. I think it's the 30th one. So we've spent 30 weeks in search, which is really interesting. We will be moving off of search and going into MLOps soon. Actually, I will be launching 2 new series. One is on MLOps, which continues like the one we are having right now, which is more like I'm doing interviews with experts to learn more about a space where I'm not a deep expert in, where I know a bunch of stuff, but I haven't worked, like don't have years of experience in. And this will be pretty similar, like basically practical deep dives onto a specific topic with experts. And we will be covering a lot in MLOps, like how to build MLOps platforms, what tools to pick, how to do inference. And we will be talking to a bunch of different people from different companies like Modal, Pattern, and a bunch of people you likely know. And at the same time, I will be starting a slightly different episode, which is in like mostly my area of expertise, which is generative AI. And I will mostly be talking with people I know who put it into production and who know their shit around generative AI, because I think there is so much noise in the space. And we will be covering like a lot, but it will be a little bit less structured. So the interviews will be a little bit more vibe-based, and we will be just chatting what we have seen work, what we are building right now, things like that, and also like current trends which are going on and our opinion on these. Like I just recorded an episode with Dexter from Human Layer on MCP, and I will be getting Vibhav from Bummel on soon, and we will be talking about a bunch of different things, what works, what doesn't, and what is really behind the hype, and how you can build better solutions with generative AI, because I think like that's where most people are building at the moment, because that's where all the hype is. Yeah, so subscribe if you want to catch the episodes. Otherwise, I will catch you soon. So see you probably in a few weeks, because I will be taking at least 2 weeks time off. See ya.